Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we are in round 4 of our coverage of the 2017 Grand Prix in Geneva, third leg of the Grand Prix. There's 4 rounds total. Our competitors today, White's going to be played by Peter Svidler, currently the 15th ranked player in the world. He has 3 draws in the first 3 rounds of the Grand Prix Geneva. His opponent playing the black pieces is Michael Adams, currently the 24th ranked player in the world. He has a win in 2 draws. So both of these players still in contention with many more rounds to go. But we'll go ahead and get into it. Peter starts out with pawn to c4. Pawn e6, knight c3, and then after pawn to d5, pawn d4, we get into the Queen's Gambit decline line. So we've had a lot of Queen's Gambit decline. That seems to be the meta at this tournament. But we'll continue. Knight to f6. Knight to f3, bishop e7. This starts to get into exactly what we saw in game 1 from Anish Giri when he started with bishop to f4 compared to your normal bishop to g5. But after bishop to f4, castle on the king side, pawn to e3, and knight to d7. So it may look familiar. This is exactly how that started. Now, Anish Giri in game 1 played pawn to c5. Kind of an unusual opening. We do have Peter Svidler going with more the traditional route, just playing queen to c2. Michael Adams continues with pawn to c5, just counterattacking on the center of the board. Pawn takes on d5, knight recaptures here, and then bishop here to d3, getting ready to castle on the king side. It's kind of blown up right here on the queen side, so we don't really expect him to be castling on the queen side of the board. Queen down here to a5, and he has a few options. You could see a pawn to h6. The bishop and the queen are both attacking the square here on h7, so it has to do something. Queen down here to a5 is a check, so that does kind of force his opponent's hand. If we see pawn to h6, you could see the capture here. Knight takes on c5, castle on the king side. This is one option. He decides to go for a little bit different route and play queen to a5, and then queen up here to c3, blocking that, and then queen back here to b6. And now if the queen wants to come to, let's say, c2 again, with this double barrel here on the h7 diagonal, then all of a sudden black has a queen in a better position than he was before. So he kind of gains a tempo in that spot. So white decides not to do that. Instead decides to go ahead and play pawn to a3, looking to push forward if he wants to with pawn to b4. And then we start to see a capture in the center of the board. The queen on b6 also helps control the center of the board right here. So we do see a capture, and the knight down here to c5 is kind of opening up the door if Michael Adams wants to exchange queens off the board. He will definitely have a weakness as far as the center is controlled, because then if we do see, capture, you could see the knight capture here. You could even see the pawn capture if he wants to have kind of these pawns in the center with no protection on either side. But either way, black is not really going to have center control. White's going to have 2 central bishops. So all in all, I think black's probably good not to exchange his queens off board, but does decide to go ahead and get his knight involved into the action. Knight to a c5, opening up the door for his light square bishop. I think he should be playing bishop down here to g4 at some point. Really wants to get this activated in the game. Bishop back here to c2, does not want to trade off his light square bishop, and then queen down here to b5, stopping the castle on the king side. You can't castle through a potential check, so all this is not check. It is attacking the square here on f1, so can't castle through that. Bishop up here to e5, just attacking the square here on g7. And then pawn to f6. And this is kind of tricky because, yes, it stops the threat of the bishop coming here to g7. Also stops the threat of the knight coming up here to g5, which is always a important square when your opponent plays knight to f3, which is very, very common. So that's why a lot of times you'll see pawn to h6 at some point from black. But what this does do is it opens up the king side of the board from black. Now, if he could get this pawn off the board, bring his king over here to h8, really try to control this semi-open file with his rook on the f file. That could definitely be good. But right now, all of a sudden, the light square bishop from white just kind of lights up and says this is now a more valuable piece because you can really just hone in on this light square diagonal right here. So that's what white's kind of looking at. For now, he's going to go ahead and retreat his dark square bishop since it is under attack, and then queen here to c4. And this is kind of one of those where if I look at it, it looks as though he played this pawn to f6. I'm not even sure that he felt good about it. He sees that he could get in some tricky situations from his opponent, and so he decides to go ahead and exchange material down on board because he thinks it could be less complicated of a position, maybe gives him a better opportunity to get into the endgame in more of a drawish place where there's less material that he has to worry about. Rook comes over here to c1, and then we do see the exchange on board. So as pieces come off, this kingside weakness definitely diminishes a little bit from black, which is kind of what Michael Adams was going for. Pawn to a5, knight up here to b5, starting a pretty strong attack. It is interesting if you look from black's point of view, he has yet to get his light square bishop involved into the game. I think that is kind of a weakness that he has in his preparation for this opening. White, on the other hand, is doing a good job controlling a lot of the board. This light square bishop's putting a lot of pressure on the king side of the board. This dark square bishop is controlling this entire diagonal right here. And also the rook on a8 really can't get activated right now. He'd like to kind of double these up, bring his rook over here to c8, bring his other rook over here to e8, potentially d8 if he wants to start pushing up his pawn a little bit. He's not really doing that because his light square bishop is blocked. He first brings his rook over here to d8, so one of those that we talked about. Knight up here to c7, attacking the rook here on a8. This knight is protected by the bishop, as we talked about on g3. Rook down here, a7. Not really where you want your rook to be, just protecting this lonely pawn, knowing that it can't come here to a6 as well because the knight would capture it. Rook over here to d1. Now both the knight and the rook are both attacking this pawn right here. So it gets a little tricky because how do you really stop this? You could bring your bishop down here to e6, but then just pawn up here to b4. You could see an exchange on board. Knight's not really going, to move because then just the bishop's going to fall. So you could see the bishop come down here to g4, attacking the rook. But then pawn up here to f3, and it just gets tricky depending on where black wants to go. He brings his knight here because if it were to take, he could bring his bishop down here and take. But all in all, it gets kind of confusing on it as far as how he stops this. He decides to go for an interesting line, I think, and that is king to f7. This has another weakness, is this square here on h7 is no longer protected. So white has a few options. He can start to attack this square in the center of the board, which taking your opponent's pawns from the center so you control more of that center, I think is always a good plan. And then later on, he can start to chip away on the pawn structure over here on the king side of the board. So that's what he starts with. Knight takes on d5, pawn here to b5, and then castle on the king side. It does have some king side safety now, and now he can just continue his game plan. Even if he wants to trade down after the bishop takes on h7, he's going to have a better endgame because he has more material. Now, Michael Adams decides to play bishop back here to f8. Not a huge fan of this move. I recognize he doesn't want to get rid of his bishop pair, and so he decides, this knight's attacking me right here, so I don't have a lot of good options. If it brings you here to d6, his opponent could just play knight to b6. This gets into a lot of trouble. This is a discovered attack with the rook on the bishop here. Also, the bishop could take it. And I think this is completely fine for white to kind of exchange down material. He's also going to be taking that pawn up here on h7. So this is kind of tough for black. But if he just brings it back to f8, he has both of his bishops on the 8th rank. That's not really where you want that to be. So yes, although he may lose his bishop pair, I think in some situations it's okay to just trade off this knight for your bishop. You don't want to have just a bishop that's no longer in the game. But that's what he does. Bishop here to f8, and then the bishop takes on h7. Pawn down here to g5, trying to push it a little bit, but not doing too much. Pawn to h4. Bishop down e6. Finally, after 25 moves in the game, we see the light square bishop get involved into the game. I think it is a little bit too late, but that's okay. Plays pawn to e4. Could have tried something else. It was somewhat difficult to find, and so I think e4, getting a nice little outpost for the knight here on d5 is completely fine. There was a tricky combination that kind of the commentators were looking at as we're looking at through all the lines that white could play, and that's bishop to g8. Now after the king takes, we see knight takes on f6 check, and there is also the discovered attack you can see up here on d8. So once the king comes down, rook up here to d8 capture, maybe bishop to e7, attacking both the pieces. Bishop up here, d6. If the rook takes, or the bishop takes the rook, bishop here to c5. Just some exchanges on board, which I think is good for white. So he could have played a line that I think was a little bit more aggressive on trading down material. He is up 3 pawns in material. So if he were to do this, I think it would be fantastic. But at the end of the day, he decides to go ahead and play pawn to e4, and then black decides to go ahead and just start exchanging, which if he would have known that he would exchange, he may not have thought as long as he did about the pawn to e4. But bishop takes on h4, bishop takes on d5, starting the exchange on board. The rooks exchange. Now there is a pass pawn on the d file for white, so black has to worry about that. Knight over here to a4, attacking the pawn on b2. And then rook to c1. And I kind of thought that, knight comes here to a4, starting to attack the pawn on b2. I think he can take this right here, but, after you see your opponent play this, attacking your pawn, and you play rook over here to c1, knowing that you can bring it into the attack, it almost looks like a trap from black's point of view. Like, maybe I calculated it incorrectly. It doesn't really look as good anymore to take this pawn because you have the advantage, and you did not seem to care about it at all. So he instead plays rook to d7, which does make some sense, although it's probably not the sharpest line for black. Just taking the pawn, I think, is a little bit better. And then rook up here to c6, nice little outpost, although you usually don't see outpost from a rook. That's kind of what he has right here. And white can just keep all his material in the center of the board off of the dark squares. The dark square bishop that black has can't really do a lot if pieces aren't on the dark squares. That's what Peter Svidler is thinking about right now. We do see the rook take, and that's fine. Rook over here on f6, check, forcing the king to move, and then bishop back here to c2. Now the knight takes on b2, finally. Rook to g6, check. King over here to f7. We do see a few more checks on board, and then rook over here to b6. So not only attacking the pawn if the rook moves, but then also allowing himself to come up to the 7th rank. Always a very powerful rank on the board for the rooks to come to. Check, and then he can kind of maneuver his bishops around as well to have a very strong attack on his opponent getting into the endgame. Michael Adams plays bishop to c5. Getting it involved into the game, but almost seems like he's just not exactly sure where he should be going with his dark square bishop. Definitely way too late to try to get involved too much, but it brings the attack down. All this is going to do is allow white to do what he wanted to do in the first place, bring his rook to b7, king to f8. So now he's kind of stopped. This has thwarted some of what black would like to do. He could have tried to be a little bit more aggressive. He didn't have tons of squares. Could have come here to h6 because both f6 and g6 are blocked off because of the bishops. But now, all of a sudden, the king can only move on this 8th rank right here. So now that white has him kind of trapped here, now he can start to maneuver his bishops around. If he wants to push forward with his pawns, he can do that as well. If he needs to activate his king, he can do that. Start to build up an attack on the king side, and then once the king can't move, then you could just have the rook come up here to b8 for a checkmate. Bishop here to g6, starting the attack. Bishop here to d4. Not really sure this is doing too much as well. Bishop e7, check. King to g8, and then kind of the final nail in the coffin, bishop to f6. And at this point, Michael Adams decides to go ahead and resign. And we see that these bishops are blocking off all of these squares that the king would like to go to. Can't go to any of those. He is threatening mate in 1. Rook here to b8 would be mate. So the only way to really stop this would be bishop to f6 taking. But then from here, we just see bishop to f7, king to h8, and then the bishop's going to take the rook here on d5. These pawns are going to fall, and then a rook and bishop with some pawn endgame is just going to be too much for black. In this particular point, black decides to go ahead and resign. So Peter Svidler, great game from him. One of the top players in the world, so good to see him come into this tournament prepared. Had a good series so far, so we'll expect to see more from him. But thank you guys for watching round 4 of the Grand Prix in Geneva, and we will see you tomorrow for round number 5.